Marrowend crouched in the valley like a thing that had once been proud and then learned to hide. Roofs leaned into each other for warmth, chimneys coughed thin breath into a sky the color of old pewter, and every lane smelled faintly of rot and rosemary. Frost stitched the cobbles every dawn. Fog rolled off the Blackfin like a slow, remembering animal. At the top of the town, where every cart and beggar passed at some point, stood the bell tower, stubby and stubborn as an old tooth, its iron tongue the only voice the villagers agreed to obey. Eira moved through these lanes with a tray balanced on calloused fingers, the tavern's low beams pressing themselves against her shoulders, the way a roof presses against a storm. The tavern was a warm, reckless heart in a town that otherwise counted its heartbeats in withheld breaths. Tankards clinked, men slurred truths into the smoke, and lanterns made each face into a small, private half-world. Eira smiled for coin and for pity in equal measure, and when the night came, she carried home the same two truths every woman knew by rote: a bowl, a blanket, a small, stubborn hope. Her mother, Mare, lay in a narrow bed in one of the attic rooms above the bakery, a place with a window that always fogged at the edges. Mare's skin had the faded translucence of peeled apples. Sometimes she coughed like rain on dry leaves. The healers said it was a sickness of the blood, old, quiet, and without name. They gave herbs and hands and words. None patched what tended to leak, unnoticed and constant. Eira learned to be precise with spoonfuls of broth and to knot her face into the small, cheerful shape people liked. But at night, when she lit the single candle and watched her mother sleep, the cheerfulness slipped like a thread, and something else sat where it had been. Outside, the bell tower tolled with a patience that felt like a promise. The villagers believed, half as superstition and half as contract, that the bell kept the old things at bay. They said the bell's sound braided with the sun's memory and made it harder for dark things to find doorways into a town. Children were told the bell listened for hunger. Old women said it listened for debt. The truth of it mattered less than the faith. People liked to believe that something measured the world besides their small anxieties. And when the wind came down from Vardenn Castle, and the castle's silhouette cut the horizon like a blade, every whisper grew heavier, not all of them human. There were stories, of course. Men told them over ale and then swore they were jokes. Children repeated them in half-formed, trembling sentences. There was a king up there, they said, an immortal with eyes cold as winter glass. He ruled by law and by hunger. The name Lucien Vardenn carried weight the way thunder carries a promise. People spoke of him quietly, as if speaking loudly might remind him to look down. Eira's life, such as it was, had the rhythm of tasks and small sacrifices. She woke before dawn to fetch water when the world was the color of bone, wiped tables that smelled of old beef and older secrets, bound blisters that never entirely closed, and carried coals to the attic bedroom for her mother. She bartered for herbs with half-smiles and learned what to say when a patron asked for more than a drink. People called her resilient. Children called her Eira the Quick behind their mother's skirts. But closer to the bone, neighbors called her cursed. It was easier to point than to ask. When the vampire raid took her father away, the night of the red moons, when the towers bled thin light and the village dogs went silent, the people had looked for a cause and found it in proximity. Eira had been 3 then, and she remembered only a shadow with a man's voice and the smell of iron. When her mother refused to stop mourning, the village comforted itself with quiet labels. A father stolen, a girl touched by darkness, an omen. Superstition thrives in the dark places superstition makes. Eira hid other things beneath the shawl she wrapped around her shoulders. When she cut herself on the tavern's rough board, the blood that came did not fall like ordinary red. It shimmered, thin as quicksilver, catching the candlelight with a color that left people staring and then suddenly looking away. At night, when fever dreams crossed her like birds, she saw a memory that was not hers. Hands cupping a child, moonlight lifting hair like a veil, a voice calling in a language that tasted of salt and iron. Once, when she fainted at the bell tower for reasons she could not name, she woke with the sound of a far-off chorus in her ears and the impression that some gate had opened just for her and shut again. She learned to keep that to herself. Secrets are expensive in small towns. They fade the way coins do. But inside her, something pulsed, a rhythm that felt older than her mother's cough and stranger than any superstition. It made her heart step out of its ordinary line when she passed the castle's shadow, or when she heard the bell toll twice instead of once. Perhaps it was merely imagination, or perhaps it was the beginning of something that had been waiting a long time for a body to remember its name. She did not have the luxury of speculation. There were bills to be paid, a mother to warm, a life to be held together in the taut, tired hands of a small woman who refused to fall apart. When the little children called her cursed, she smiled anyway and let them think it. It hurt less that way. The storm came on the back of a long, loaded dusk. It first made the air feel like the inside of a closed chest, dense, expectant, and then it moved like a beast deciding to stand. The old bell tower shivered under clouds as black as old ink, and villagers shuttered windows and crossed themselves in doorways. The bells began to sound, slow and hollow, as if the iron itself had something important to say. Eira worked that night until the tavern thinned to the last murmurs. She wiped a tankard with hands that smelled of bone and rosemary, then hurried home, the wind unlacing her scarf and carrying about it a taste of cold and something else, a faint metallic tang, like the first breath of a wound. At the top of the lane, the bell's tone altered, quivering like a string about to snap. Lightning took the sky in a white knife and answered the call. It struck the tower without a sound one might expect, no thunderous crack that split roofs, only a bright, careful line that ran downward and bruised the iron. For one vertiginous second, the world was everything. Fire, wind, the taste of ozone, the smell of something old and burnt. Then the bell fell silent. Silence poured into the streets like a new thing. Men cursed, babies woke and cried. The bell's silence felt obscene, as if the town's ribs had been unlatched and all the small animals of superstition had spilled free. People gathered at the square with lanterns. Mothers knelt. Old men spat into their hands. Some whispered that the bell had given them protection, and that without it the Vardenn shadow might come closer than it had before. A child's voice cut through the murmuring, small, raw, as if it had been carrying itself a long way. "Please," she said. "Please save my mom." I returned. The child was mud-streaked and thin, a dress too big and eyes rimmed by fear. Her hair had been braided and half-loosened by the rain. She looked at Eira as if she had been expecting her all along. "Where is she?" Eira asked before she could think. Habit had her tending first. The little girl pointed without words, her finger quivering toward the shape of the blackfin and the dark that spread like spilled ink toward the high line where Vardenn's trees began to thicken. "She went into the reeds," the girl said, each syllable a small, desperate coin. "She says there's a way to the castle that's not watched. Please, please, I beg you." Eira had every reason not to go. Reeds were dangerous. The blackfin had teeth. The castle was a place that swallowed vows. But the plea came out of a place inside her that knew the taste of thinness, of mothers who were cold and who needed hands. Something old in her answered. They walked. Lanterns bobbed behind them, a few folk following like moths, but the child moved with a speed that made the marsh think her smaller. The rain stitched into their hair, and the fog swallowed the edges of the world until the trees took on the look of pillars holding up night. At the border where Marrowend's human caution ended and Vardenn's older law began, the air changed. It went from wet to tense, as if the world were holding its breath. Near the castle's outer moat, the child stopped. She looked back once at Eira, and then she was gone. Not hidden, not lost, simply gone, as if the mist had been an honest cloak and she had stepped through it to some other place. Eira called her name into the fog and found nothing but the taste of metal and the distant, regular beat of her own pulse. It was there, in that breathless moment, that night erupted into motion. Figures separated from the trees like thought made physical, tall, too sure, dressed not in the rough leather of men, but in garments that swallowed light. Their eyes were not eyes but dark mirrors. At their backs, teeth gleamed when they spoke. The world contracted to the sound of movement, the whisper of cloaks, the soft slap of boots on moss, the click of armor that seemed embroidered with shadow. Eira had time for one thought, that the town would hear her cry and it would be useless, and then hands took her. They were cool as river stones, and certain as law. She did not struggle enough to make the captors bother with the theatrics. There was an efficiency in their touch that suggested they had practiced the taking of people who were meant for more than mundane ends. They dragged her toward a gate that had never been opened to the common folk, a gate ringed with sigils that made the hair at the back of Eira's neck stand on end. The castle rose as if it had been stitched to the sky, spires like waiting teeth, windows like watchful lids. Candles moved behind the glass like slow-moving hearts. She was brought before him in a hall where the air tasted of old books and rose petals gone to dust. He sat on a chair that could have been carved from the bones of the world if such things were possible, a thing of cold angles and tapestries that trapped light and made it slower. When Lucien Vardenn rose, the room seemed to obey him. The candles straightened, a draught smoothed, and the shadows unraveled in a perfect, almost courteous bow. He was younger than Eira had imagined and older than any man she had seen. His face bore the soft cruelty of a statue carved in moonlight. His eyes were the color of glass on a winter pond, and they passed over her with a curiosity that was not quite human. "You came because your blood called," he said, not unkindly, as if this were a fact read from a ledger and not the outcome of some small girl's fear. His voice filled the hall, cultured, precise, the kind of voice men used when they wished to turn pain into arithmetic. "You were meant once, Eira of Marrowend. The prophecy takes its time." Her name in his mouth scraped like a blade. "What prophecy?" Her voice was small and unwilling to be brave. He smiled then, a slow thing that was more shadow than warmth. "The blood heir," he said. "When silver bleeds for crimson, when the child of the old line walks into the king's shadow, a choice will be given. Either the hunger ends or the world ends. You have come early or late. It depends on whether one believes in the kindness of clocks." The hall tightened. Somewhere, a door closed as if the world had made the sound of a fate being nailed shut. Eira's hands shook. She did not yet know whether fear or some older, stranger thing in her chest was what made her pulse quicken. Lucien's gaze lingered on her wrist, where a small cut she had not noticed in the scuffle still bled a sliver of silver into the stone floor. "It called to me," Lucien murmured, and there was a tenderness in it that made the blood on her skin feel both precious and dangerous. "Not for me to take, little defiant one, for the choice to be made." Around them, the court, those who had been summoned in whispers and gilded parchment, leaned forward like a forest sensing rain. Eira felt every eye as if they were weights tied to her shoulders. She had come chasing a child's plea, and now the world folded in on itself, naming her. Outside, somewhere far below the tower where the bell should have warned the sleeping town, people gathered with lanterns. They waited in the square, and some prayed, and some sharpened knives. None of them could have guessed that a storm had knocked a bell quiet, and in that silence set in motion, a thing that would not allow the world to sleep as it once had the castle had been built, as if someone remembered what kings were supposed to feel like, and then misread the instructions. It sat like a crown inverted, hollow within, carved with chambers that folded into each other, halls that drank light and kept it for years. Columns of black stone rose like the ribs of some long-dead leviathan, and tapestries older than languages hung limp, their threads whispering the names of occupants who no longer needed them. Windows were long eyes set with glass that caught the moon and splintered it into shards of silver. Candles in the corridors burned slow and measured, their wax pooling in perfect, patient sculptures. Eira had been brought into such a place with all the delicate, indifferent ceremony of a thing that had been expected. Servants with pale smiles and collars, high as the collars of caged birds, guided her through halls where portraits watched and remembered. The air smelled of old books, rose water gone to a powder, and something like copper, as though the castle itself were always on the verge of bleeding. The footsteps that accompanied her were soft, not from lack of strength but from a practiced politeness that marked those who had never needed to hurry. She kept her hands to herself. It was a courtesy the castle rewarded. Hands that learned to be small were less likely to cause trouble. The throne room was an expanse that made lungs feel too small for the job of breathing. Lucien's court gathered there under a high ceiling, painted with constellations no living astronomer knew. At their head sat the vampire king, as if the chair had grown him, the fabric claiming the angles of his shoulders, and the throne tracing the curve of his spine. Around him clustered noble families whose faces held the architecture of their ambition. Jaws sharpened like knives, eyes like small, dangerous amenities. Each bore the pale geometry of immortality, but their eyes burned with why. Why should one bloodline prevail? Why should hunger be cured? Why should one lord rule unchallenged? The silver vein, a woman murmured close enough for Eira to hear, more prayer than analysis. She wore a collar of bone and a brooch that had the semblance of a raven. Her name was Marrowend, a noble with reputational teeth, and she was not the only one to move her lips to the phrase. The court had learned to speak prophecy like weather. It made them sound like people who knew storms by their wind. They wanted her for reasons that made the throat of the world tighten. Lucien listened, while men and women unfolded arguments like maps. The silver vein could be used to ease the curse and return them to a life where hunger did not command everything. It could be weaponized to make their line impenetrable to sunlight. It could be yoked to power and sold as salvation. They argued in economic metaphors, as if what they proposed were ships or grain. In that court, even salvation was an investment. Lucien's face was a study in restraint. When he spoke, he shaped his sentences like knives wrapped in linen. He did not desire what they desired, not in the way the nobles thought. He had seen centuries. He had read grief slowly enough to know its weight, yet he was not immune to fascination. Eira's defiance had an honesty that complicated the arithmetic of his immortality. There was something in the way she refused to be small that made him remember what it had been to grow. "You will be patient," he told his court, an order that landed like a cool coin. "We will not butcher our future in the heat of need. If there is to be a choice, we will not make it an act of cruelty in front of children." His voice carried the authority of someone who had been obeyed long enough to trust the sound of his own years. He spared her life for reasons that were not announced like gifts. To look at her and decide to keep her was a private verdict. Perhaps it was curiosity, the small, terrible curiosity of any creature that has eaten too long and finds something new on its plate. Perhaps it was that, when he peered at her wrists and saw the almost silver blood bead there, he recognized a pattern his memory had once traced across another woman's cheek. Or perhaps it was the faint echo of a promise he could not yet name, the feeling that some clock somewhere had already wound itself toward a decision. Around them, the court murmured and schemed. There were proposals whispered with the delicacy of poison. Experiments, marriages, diplomatic trade that thinly veiled execution. The nobles measured Eira's face as if it were a map to a coast they had never seen but wanted to claim. She felt them like weights pressed against skin. Lucien, however, folded his hands and wore patience like armor. That choice, to keep rather than to kill, to question rather than to yield, shifted the tenor of the hall. It was not mercy so much as necessity dressed in the shape of a rose. The nobles left with curt bows and uncurtained thoughts. The court closed its book and let the murmurs rise in the castle's empty spaces. Eira was watched, catalogued, and carried to a chamber that resembled a room in a dream, luxury without heat, comfort without trust. She had expected chains. She found instead a room that was a testament to careful, complicated restraint. Curtains heavy as remorse, a bed spread with linens that smelled faintly of lavender, a single window that looked out on the castle's inner garden where roses had turned to stone. They kept her alive. They intended to keep her bright enough for use. Captivity, as it turned out, had degrees. The castle's prison for her was not the dungeons the town had invented in rumor. It was a suite the nobles called observation. Her hands remained free. Her feet were not in shackles. Meals were presented with a formality that hinted at hospitality rather than punishment, silver plates and fruits that tasted like memory. Yet every corridor she walked left impressions in her like the impression of a hand on a soft cheek, both a mark and a memory. The first nights were restless with a strange, sagging quiet. She woke to the sound of pages turning, to the distant echo of servants gliding like pale seals through halls, and to a kind of loneliness that had the density of stone. But the castle, for all its coldness, was a library of careful information. There were those among Lucien's retinue who traded in knowledge rather than teeth, and they found her as one finds a raw instrument. Interesting, dangerous, and singular. Seraphine discovered her on the third morning. She arrived like a book opening. Tall, all bone and silk, with hair black and long as a raven's wing, she carried a satchel of scrolls and a look that read people the way others read scripts. Her eyes were turned glass, and her voice was slow and sweet like the dropping of honey. She moved with the assurance of someone who had been given time to learn languages no living mouth used. "You are called by many names in my notes," Seraphine said the first time she seated herself opposite Eira. "The quick, the tainted, the child of the old promise. I prefer Eira. It suits you." Eira bristled on principle. "You prefer what pleases you." Seraphine smiled, not cruelly. "I prefer what is accurate." She unrolled a scroll and laid it on a small table as if presenting a treasure. In the curling script that smelled faintly of iron and ink, she had mapped genealogies, bloodlines braided into one another like vines. She pointed at a name. "Mare!" Her finger touched the name with reverence. "She is written into more than one ledger." Eira's jaw tightened. "My mother is a baker's widow, nothing more." "Names are slippery things," Seraphine replied, "and people even more so. Your mother saved a life long ago, a debt now repaid across ages. You carry what she left behind." The revelation came little by little. Seraphine spoke of the silver vein, a line of women whose blood contained an alloy of elements, something that made it, in the right hands, either a balm or a blade. In certain circumstances, the blood could staunch hunger. In others, it could burn the unblessed like sunlight. Centuries ago, a woman like Mare had bargained with a vampiric lord, trading a life for a promise. He had taken her oath and left a stain in the ledger of fate. Seraphine read to Eira the parts of history that had been hilltop gossip and then made them into evidence. The story gathered weight until the name of Eira's mother was no longer the name of a woman kneading dough, but the signature on a contract whose ink had lasted generations. "Why me?" Eira asked, the question simple enough to be honest and dangerous enough to be insulting. "Why my blood?" "Because the silver vein is narrow," Seraphine said. "It appears and disappears the way tides appear and disappear. It is selective. It prefers certain lives. Your mother's blood recognized the pattern in the king's curse and made a bargain. You are that bargain made flesh." Seraphine's voice was clinical, but her eyes were not. "There is more. You have visions. That is not common." Eira did not need encouraging to speak of the visions. The language in her head had been growing teeth. At night, memories that were not hers, images of moonlit chairs, songlines in an old dialect, a woman with her hands cupped around a throat, arrived like letters delivered to the wrong address. Seraphine examined these dreams as a scholar would examine a specimen, with curiosity, with notes, with a small, professional chill. "You are waking a memory," Seraphine said quietly. "Whether it is yours, borrowed, or otherwise, I cannot say, but the castle answers to it. Lucien felt that when he saw your blood." The castle learned to move around knowledge. Eira's days were populated by small interrogations disguised as courtesy. A tutor named Havin offered her lessons in languages he swore were useful for negotiation. A woman named Ussel brought her music that sounded like statues breathing. In the quiet hours, Seraphine continued to unspool history for her. She told of vows made under moonlight, of bargains signed in wet ink with blood a third lighter than the mortal equivalent. She told Eira about Lucien as a man who had once tried to be gentle, but had learned to be cruel out of necessity. As a sovereign who had ruled by laws only those who had lived long enough could imagine. And yet there was kindness in Seraphine that did not smell like a bargain. She brought Eira essays on healing written in a hand that was elegant and patient, and she taught Eira to bind wounds with a technique that made even the servants stare. "Knowledge is a currency," Seraphine said, "but so is trust. Spend yours well." The education was a course in power as much as survival. At night the visions grew clearer. Eira dreamed of a woman standing beneath a tree whose roots ran like veins, whose fruit bled light when split. A child's face hovered between the woman and a man with eyes like frozen ponds. In dreams, she sometimes touched that man's hand, and it was always colder than the surface of a river in winter. She woke with a taste of iron in her mouth, and the impression that some decision had been postponed only to be revisited with cruel punctuality. It was a hard, slow becoming. She learned that her blood could be a hinge. She learned that people in long lives became clever with meaning, wringing every advantage out of a name or a prophecy. And the more she learned, the more the castle's walls felt less like a prison and more like a courtroom in which she was to be judged not by her actions, but by the ledger of the ages. There is intimacy in pain. It is a dangerous intimacy because it owes nothing to consent, but everything to need. Lucien, for someone who had ruled nights and winters, had a relationship with pain as regular as a lover who visits nightly. It was an old custom. He walked it with an elegance that, when directed at others, felt like an examination. Yet when he sought relief from the curse that had hollowed his chest with hunger, he found himself at a strange intersection. The silver blood steadied him, temporarily knitting the hunger into something bearable. It began with ritual more than cruelty. There is a ceremony to feeding in Lucien's world, not the crude violence of stories, but a structured, almost surgical thing. He would not take what he needed in shadows. He would do it in sunlight thought in the wrong language, under controlled conditions, so as not to make a spectacle and not to desecrate the potential in front of him. He asked Eira, as one asks for the use of a room, because he had the economy of centuries and liked rules. "You will understand," he told her in a voice that was velvet and steel. "The hunger is not mere appetite, it is a force. And there are laws." Eira's first feeding was a quiet betrayal. The servants fussed with linens and hot water. He sat with the patience of a man using time as an instrument. She felt his breath near her ear, and the smell of him was not like the townsmen who had made her life difficult. It was clean in the way a museum's air is clean, preserved and forceful. He had the hands of a man who had learned to perform gentleness as a skill. There was an exchange. Her blood, a ribbon of something laced with silver, and his restraint, which held back hunger like a tide held by a man-made dam. The first time his mouth touched her skin, Eira felt something strange and unfamiliar. Not pain as townspeople defined it, but a clarity, a coldness that lit up the world like a struck match. His eyes closed for a second as if the simplicity of the act transported him elsewhere. He did not drink like a beast, he drank like someone reading a prayer. Afterward, he trembled, something in him rearranging itself. Lucien looked at her with an openness that unsettled his closest counselors. For the first time in many years, his face bore an expression that was not calculation. There was something like grief there, a softness that startled Eira into thinking him less monstrous than everyone else had described. "You are not a thing to be used, Eira," he said later, when she caught him standing at her window. The castle moonlight painted his profile in silver. "And yet I will need what you have. The law is a chain I do not wish to break lightly." It was an invitation and a denial all at once. He admitted need. He refused surrender. They met in that place between necessity and gentleness, where conversations spelled out agreements and their silences made them complicit in a new kind of understanding. Their conversations turned into something like the beginning of trust. Lucien told her of the hunger like a trade he could not avoid. He described the way it gnawed at him as if they were old creditors, and Eira listened with a comprehension that surprised them both. She learned that love and predation could, in his world, be distinct things, that one could feed from another without surrendering the moral spine of the exchange. It was a cruel comfort. "Help me," she said once, when the ache in her chest was no longer a thing she could pretend was only for drama. "If you can feel again, if this blood does something to you, then help me save my mother. Let me return with proof that I was cared for and not plundered." Lucien's face darkened into multiple shadows. "I cannot cross the border without consequences. Even a king's steps have weight. To walk into Marrowend openly is to invite war. Their fear is a blade they already sharpened." "What if we do it quietly?" Eira whispered, plucking at the seam of the curtain. "If you can move among your people and be unchanged." "Borders do not bend to wishes," he said, and the bluntness of that sentence was its own kind of sorrow. "And if I cross into human lands, even to do good, the nobles would say it is a political maneuver, and they would start a war to take what they thought they deserved. I will not start a war for a favor." His refusal broke something open in Eira, but it did not close her heart. Instead, it made their negotiations more intimate. They began to barter in smaller things. Lucien would lend knowledge. He showed her a library of books where the margins were annotated with centuries. He taught her to read old alphabets. In return, Eira gave him truth, the smell of bread cooling at dawn, stories of what it felt like to be mortal and afraid. When she spoke of Mare, of the cough that made mornings a landscape of ragged breaths, his eyes softened the way someone who has kept a long silence does when finally permitted to speak. There was a fragility to their burgeoning tenderness. It was threaded through with ethics, with law, with obligations. Yet tenderness does not always wait for permission. There were moments in which the distance between them thinned. Lucien would reach out, with the long, decisive gesture of one who has ruled and learned to hesitate, and touch the knuckle of her hand as if testing if a human still revered contact as an act of trust. She noticed hands that had known command becoming gentle in small places, arranging a sheet, teaching a knot to tie as sailors tie lines to promises. He would sometimes read aloud to her, letting the cadence of language be a balm to both. The intimacy was not only emotional. The law that prohibited a sovereign's impulsive generosity had teeth, but Lucien moved in the world of loopholes. He would reach into the city ledger and silence a name that it had been cruel to keep alive. When Eira's father's name surfaced in a dusty record, noted as missing and presumed dead, Lucien kept the entry private. "Some histories are kinder when left to rest," he said. For Eira, these small acts were tenderness disguised as governance. But tenderness has a cost. The nobles watched, with all the liturgical patience of predators learning a new hunt. They construed intimacy as conspiracy. Rumors that the king wanted to use Eira's blood for his own resurrection slipped into whispers, and then into the pages of those who plotted. The tension that hummed in the castle corridors was no longer just about prophecy. It had the texture of jealousy and fear. One night, as winter rain stitched the castle roof into a steady percussion, Eira and Lucien shared a conversation that was both a confession and a strategy. In the hush between them, where the world seemed paused for judgment, Lucien said, "If the world can be shaped without crashing into the poor, it will be worth saving. But to move without losing ourselves will be our greatest test." She touched his sleeve, and for a second their hands were where two different kinds of grief met. They did not need to say the words aloud. They were building a fragile architecture of mutual rescue, which meant neither would be saved without the other's risk. Outside, the town did not sleep. News moves by tongues, and tongues love the taste of catastrophe. Eira's disappearance, or abduction, depending on the teller, became a rumor that was a kind of contagion. Men sharpened tools in anger, as if the rusty temper of their courage could be whetted back into a blade. The bell's silence had been resonant enough to unnerve even the cowards. In the market, a baker's boy slapped down his loaf and swore he had seen vampire shadows. Someone nailed a wooden stake into a post, as if to make spectacle for others to copy. The nobles of Marrowend were not wrong to be afraid. The unknown had a geography all its own. They could not imagine the castle's interior politics. They could not conceive of treaties written in blood. They saw instead an immortal court that had taken a village child and possessed itself. In the square, speeches grew longer and promises shorter. Someone organized a militia stitched from grief and old points of honor. The militia called itself a necessary sword, though the word necessary trembled in mouths unused to wielding it. Back inside the castle, the prophecy emerged in a context both scholarly and conspiratorial. Seraphine, who had seemed a friend and a mentor, began to move with the efficiency of one who had a plan shaped in her bones. She had long been a keeper of records and a teacher of things that pried open time. But knowledge, if not guarded by compassion, is a very dangerous shepherd. She had whispered to certain nobles the parts of the ledger that made the most generous metaphors. The silver vein will either bind the hunger or burn the world. In darkened corridors, she laid out possibilities as if she were an architect of futures. Eira learned the precise phrasing of the prophecy in a manner that made its language feel like a trap set for her. "When silver bleeds for crimson," Seraphine recited one evening, as if testing the syllables against a tuning fork. "When silver bleeds for crimson, the sun shall rise on one who is both." The sentence was a blade in an embroidered sheath. She continued as if reading a recipe. "The blood heir will choose, either the end of our hunger or the end of the world as we know it." "What does it mean?" Eira asked. because despite all the scrolls and all the learned explanations, the prophecy still carried a kernel of rawness that only understanding could ache to remove. "It means there is a hinge," Seraphine said. "A choice that will open a door or close one forever. It is not a riddle written for amusement. It is a legal clause, a constraint on fate." But Seraphine's eyes had another business in them. The scholar's curiosity had hardened into strategy. Eira noticed the way Seraphine lingered over certain phrases, the way she compared genealogies with the practiced greed of someone hunting a specific animal. One night, Eira overheard, because bunkers of tactic are built of whispers, Seraphine speaking with Mern and another noble. "Her blood can be used to remove the hunger from the line," the scholar said, practical as a surgeon. "It will not be a graceful operation. It is likely to be fatal to the vessel, but the result will be worth the sacrifice." Eira's blood turned cold in her. Sacrifice, the word folded in a dozen languages, always returned to the same cruelty. Someone else's death as currency. Seraphine's voice, which had been a guide, now sounded like scales balancing a life. "We could make the payment," she said. "The line will survive and the age of hunger will be over." "There must be another way," the noble with the raven brooch replied. "There must be a bargain." "Bargains have been tried," Seraphine said softly. "The ledger is meticulous. The law of our kind is not inclined toward mercy when a certain solution is in hand." Eira stepped back, and the floor felt suddenly too far away. She realized, with the icy lucidity of someone reading betrayal in a familiar script, that Seraphine intended to use her. The woman who had taught her to wrap wounds and read scrolls had mapped out a route that ended in Eira's death. Betrayal rents weird seams into one's world. Once sewn with the thread of trust, those seams are most painful when cut. Eira felt the cut like a fresh wound. She did not collapse, however. Hardening had been the town's lesson to her. When life breaks you, become less breakable. She went to Lucien with the knowledge she had unearthed like a weapon. She expected fury or denial. She found instead a complicated sorrow. "You knew," she demanded when she found him in the library, the room tasting like paper and rain. "You knew what Seraphine and the council were planning." "I suspected," Lucien said, and in that admission was a canyon of regret. "I have not been blind to the possibility that ambition would wear the guise of salvation. Seraphine is a scholar, yes. She is also pragmatic in a manner that lacks tenderness." "Why did you not tell me?" Eira asked. Her voice cracked on the simple want of it. "Why would you let them plan my death like a trade?" "Because to reveal their intention might have accelerated it," he said, shutting a book with a decision that made the room feel like a cage. "Because even in governance we learn to hold our children as one holds fire, at a distance sufficient to be safe. Because I hope to broker a solution without blood on your hands." The hope was a thin thing, but it was real. It made Eira a participant in a plan. She understood his logic enough to know that he moved in constraints she had not imagined. Laws, history, a court full of teeth that bit when their vanity was pricked. They plotted then in the shadowed corners like thieves who were trying to be righteous. Lucien offered her an escape plan. The way would be small and dangerous. He could contrive a passage for her into the borderlands if she carried with her a seal of the court and the guise of a traveling scholar. It meant leaving everything she had known behind, including the hope that a mother might be saved by a visible act of benevolence. "You must go alone," he said, "because anything else will lead the council to suspect subterfuge. I will give the smallest of escorts in name only, a record that you traveled and a sealed letter from the court. It will be enough to quiet some curiosities and to inflame others." Eira's first thought was of Mare, alone in the attic with a cough that sounded like something trying to claw back into the world. To leave her was an act that felt like desertion, but staying risked becoming an offering. "Will you come with me?" she asked then, because the last stubbornness of the town lived in her, and it demanded either courage or proof that she was loved. He looked at her with the kind of cruelty that is mercy's twin. "If I crossed into Marrowend openly," he said, "it would cause a war. I will not be the hand that brings blood to your streets." She heard the refusal like a bell with a cracked tone. But his plan, however bitter, was the only one with a pulse. That night, as the castle slept in a manner that had the serenity of guilty things, Eira prepared for departure. Seraphine's betrayal had taught her that knowledge without agency is a slow suffocation. Escape was not innocence, it was survival. Lucien's covert assistance would be a kind of treachery against his court, and she took the weight of that as a small, private gift. The dawn's light was a thin promise when she slipped through a corridor that smelt of mildew and ghost-sweet candles. Men with shadows for jackets and hearts for sale signed sheets and nodded as if part of the ploy. In the garden, statues watched them go with the expression of stone that does not judge. Lucien came to the edge of the garden and did not kiss her, nor did he offer florid farewells. Instead, he pressed a small token to her palm, a ring sealed with a sigil that read like a sovereign's quiet blessing. "Go," he said, and his voice held the hush of a man who knew which doors could not be reopened. "Find your mother. Find a life that does not belong to prophecy." Eira left by a path the servants called the Scholar's Route. It was a strange corridor of service and secrecy that climbed down into the world like a careful thread. They crossed the moor that creaked with reeds and fattened shadows. They crossed the border where the air changed from measured to raw. Behind her, the castle's spires receded into the sky like teeth removed. Ahead, the town of Marrowend sprawled, ragged and human, with its bells still mute, and its people beginning to pour into the streets with suspicion and hunger. As they crossed, Lucien's rider, a nominal escort who was mostly exercise in legality, rode close enough that Eira could hear the sound of his breath in the thin morning. It was a concession and a risk. It showed the Empire the shape of mercy without painting it as surrender. When she passed the first stretch of common road, the townsfolk saw a familiar figure and then a stranger-shaped thing that the nobles called a king's seal. There were glances like spearheads. Some stitched their doubts into prayers. But the world did not immediately explode into war. It was almost as if, in that narrow choice, the needle had found a thread that might hold. Eira's relief was not the absence of fear, but the knowledge that the arc of her life had been bent by a decision. She was safe for now, but safety was not salvation. The prophecy lurked like a shadow still at her shoulder. She had run from death only to become the locus of an argument whose terms were written in older ink than the town's walls. The choice that the prophecy insisted on had not left her. It had simply moved closer, like the sound of a bell that one could not yet hear but whose toll would not fail to come. In the weeks that followed, as she walked the path back into care for Mare, the castle of crimson mirrors receded into the horizon, but the reflection it had left in her, of love shaped by rules, of tenderness shadowed by claim, stayed like a scar reminding her that even reprieve carries its cost. Their bond, strained and strange, had deepened. They had traded secrets for small mercies, and both had been altered by the bargain. The world had become more complicated. Eira had become both a fugitive and an heir. The air above Marrowend smelled of iron and old promises. Word of Eira's return. A woman stepped from the castle's shadow with a king's seal clenched in her palm. Did not soothe the town. It sharpened the knives of fear. Men gathered as if fear were an inheritance to be maintained. Fathers with sons who were trying on bravery like new coats. Priests who had never expected to preach in daylight about blood and bargain. The bell remained mute, its absence a hollow drum in the middle of the town's expectations. Without its customary toll, nightmares wore their faces and walked around openly. The militia formed with the messy efficiency of anger. Torches burned like a rash of beacons as they marched, and at their head were men who had joined the war for reasons older than Eira, for lost family, for reputations, for debts they believed could be repaid in another man's blood. They carried stakes and spears and a righteousness that mistook sound for right. The nobles of Marrowend, once cautious of stirring the castle's ire, now found their courage in numbers. They demanded retribution for the audacity they perceived in the king's act of leniency. At dawn, they came for the castle. Vardenn's outer sentries were punctual and cold. They had practiced defense and offense for centuries. In the face of panic, they performed the latter with the discipline of a ritual. When the town's militia reached the outer moors, they found not a single line of human opposition, but a curtain of pale faces like a second winter. Vampires emerged from shadow, not with the grotesque theatrics of legend, but with the geometric precision of a military mind. Cavalry that slid over the marsh, archers perched on battlements like carved gargoyles, and infantry who moved with the soundless composure of winter snow falling. The first hour of battle was not crowned by heroics, but by the dull accounting of survival. Men who had sworn to protect their homes found themselves bewildered by the quiet of their opponents. A spear met a blade, and nothing exploded in cinematic show. Everything shifted quietly toward the inevitable. The vampires fought with the skill of creatures who had had 1,000 years to perfect economy. Every movement saved effort. Every attack reserved cruelty until it was necessary. Eira stood at the castle's inner parapet with Lucien at her side, wrapped in a cloak that ate the dawn. The two of them watched lines meet lines and watched how small the differences between monster and man could seem when the equation was reduced to who moved first. "Do your people understand what they are doing?" she asked, not because she expected the answer to change anything, but because she needed to hear it aloud. Lucien's mouth was a hard line. "They understand what they were taught. The world is theirs or it is not. They are not all wrong, but they are wrong in the measure of what will be lost." Below, the town pressed forward with a litany of cries. Banners snapped like the tongues of angry things. The vampires' counterattacks were clean and lethal. They aimed to incapacitate rather than to slaughter indiscriminately, but such discipline still left human lines broken and bleeding. The moral cost was immediate and raw. Mothers clutched sons to their chests, as if by sheer will they could stitch the torn flesh of their lives back together. In the confusion, news of Mare's capture, that she had been found and dragged toward the castle with ropes and curses like a prize and a burden, flashed through the human lines like flares. She had been taken not because she was priceless, but because she was near where the militia had pushed. A mother caught between two engines of violence becomes, in practice, the thing both sides believe they ought to possess. When Eira learned of it, the ground beneath her felt like the throat of a beast. She wanted to run and tear at the world with her bare hands, to find Mare and shove against the cogs of a destiny not yet engaged in the mechanics of prophecy. Lucien saw the color drain from her face as if he were seeing the winter arrive again, and he could not pretend to have a different season. "Bring her down," she demanded. "Now." "Impossible," he said. "The front is chaotic. If I move openly to retrieve her, the nobles will see it as a sign of weakness. They will seize the moment to claim sovereignty. You know what it will mean." "What will it mean?" Her voice broke on its own weight. "That we hand over my mother to some law, that you watch while they make a sacrifice of her." Lucien's hands tightened into a fist that bent the heavy fabric of his cloak. "It means war. It means this becomes less about one woman and more about an entire line claiming precedence. It means decisions will be made by the bloodiest amongst us, not by conscience." She blinked, and the world refocused. Men running, a boy carrying his sister, a priest trying to shepherd a column. The battlefield became a theater of intimate tragedies. A child whose face was a map of shock, a woman who clutched a sack of flour as if it contained the future, an old man who used his cane like a weapon. The human losses mounted like bad weather. The vampires' discipline minimized their own casualties, but each life taken or maimed bent the moral scaffolding of both sides. In the thick of the siege, the castle's heart, a hush in which Lucien and his inner circle made choices, pulsed with the strange arithmetic of power. The council argued in tones like scalpel strokes, whether to offer a parley, whether to surrender a name or a person to ease the human frenzy. Some wanted to make an example of Mare to rebuke the militia's insolence. Others argued for a show of restraint that could be a statement of a new morality. Each stance was a gamble. "Bring her to the chapel," Lucien commanded at last, and the words were a cliff the court backed away from with the sound of breaking bone. The chapel was neutral ground by law, a place the old compacts had labeled sacrosanct because even predators respected the illusion of sanctity. If Mare were placed there, she might be treated not as a prize, but as a hinge. They brought her in with the awkward reverence with which people carry a thing that is both valuable and fragile. She was pale and ragged, a thin shawl press-stained with mud and blood. Her breath left the shallow, rattling rhythm of a bell with a broken clapper. Eira ran to her and fell to her knees, hands on cheeks too thin, forehead to cheek in a gesture that was more prayer than plan. "Mare," she whispered, and the name was the only compass left. "Mare, it's me. It's Eira." The mother's eyes fluttered. Her gaze found her daughter as if at last someone had given her lungs back a task. She smiled like a prayer, and coughed so hard it made the room tilt. A healer from the castle, an old woman who had seen many such scenes, leaned in and listened. Her mouth worked like a stern but kind ledger. "She's poisoned or cursed," the healer said finally. "The blood is wrong. It clots but does not heal. Whatever took hold of her is not ordinary." Eira's heart did a slow, ferocious thing. "Can you help her?" The healer's eyes met Lucien's, and in that exchange 1,000 histories flitted like birds. "We can try," the healer said, "but the roots are deep. There is a pattern here beyond stitches and miraculous poultices." Outside the chapel, the battle's din thinned, then rose again like breath in a sleep not yet peaceful. Both sides watched the small chapel like a man might watch his child cross a river. The fragile hope was that a mother held in a place of compact might be spared the worst of the carnage. But compacts are paper. War laughs at paper. Eira sat by her mother's side and felt for any movement of warmth. In the center of herself, something answered with a faint, familiar ache, a lowing like a distant animal, an insistence she could not yet name. She pressed her palms on Mare's wrist. The healers murmured that it was not only a physical illness, but a thing written in blood. It echoed the curse that had shaped Lucien's court. If that were true, then her mother's life was a ledger entry, and the cost to rewrite a ledger in a world this old would be counted in lives. Lucien stood at the chapel's doorway and watched with a face that had the composition of a man watching a clock wind down. He had always known that he would have to make choices that tasted of iron. Now the iron was on the table like a plate. He looked at Eira and saw a future that could be bright or ended. The prophecy's hiss that had lived in rumor had found voice in the smallest of rooms. "We can storm the militia," he said suddenly, "and take them in a violent sweep. We can break their ranks and end this immediately." "No," Eira snapped, the word like a sword thrown off a rack. "Not like that. We will be the ones who become the tyrants." Her mind raced for options like a desperate gambler counting a hand. The prophecy's phrasing, "when silver bleeds for crimson," twined around her like a vine. If the curse that had injured her mother was the same that birthed Lucien's hunger, then perhaps the ledger could be rewritten not with the spear, but with the sacrifice of the one who could bridge both lines. The thought landed like a stone in a pond. Its ripples were decisions, and the center was a choice no one could step around. She looked at Lucien then, and there was no triumph in the look, only the steady, terrible resolve that comes when a person chooses what the world insists upon rather than what it asks for. "If my blood can end this," she said, each word careful, "then tell me how. Tell me what will happen if I give it." He stepped close enough that she could see the tremor in his jaw, the way his centuries had taught him to count grief like currency. "The ritual is old," he said. "It demands that the one who bears the silver vein offer their blood at a point where moonlight and human breath cross. The blood will mingle with the curse. The source of the hunger may be dissolved. But the vessel you may not survive. Some will become mortal, some will be reduced to ash. It is not a certain panacea. It is a risk measured in the heaviest terms." She swallowed, tasting iron and salt. "And the sun," he hesitated. "If the ritual succeeds, legend says that the sun will remember what it once was. The armor of darkness may crack." He did not promise more. He could not. The ledger had no guarantees that would hold in the face of human hope. Eira closed her eyes and breathed the small, thin breath of a woman with little left to barter. She thought of the bell, and the way its absence had been like an unlatched door. She thought of the little child who had first led her toward the castle and vanished like mist. She thought of Mare's hands, which had taught her to braid bread and to braid courage the same way. "Then we do it," she said. It was not a brave proclamation so much as an acceptance, as if she had been offered a choice and had finally decided to act. Lucien reached for her hand, and she did not pull away. Around them, the chapel hummed with the low sound of a world trying to hold itself together. They prepared the ritual with a reverence that felt like a knell. The chapel had been cleared of extraneous heat. Candles were placed in an arrangement that made their light move in a slow, deliberate choreography. Seraphine, who had once plotted Eira's death with practical geometry, stood at a corner with her face, a mask no pattern of feeling could decode. Some among the council protested the very idea that a single person should be asked to give themselves for the many, but the siege's moral arithmetic had grown blunt and certain. The battle outside seemed to compress all decisions into one narrow vein. Eira lay upon a stone slab, which the old compacts had deemed neutral ground. The air smelled of lavender and iron and the faint sweetness of mare's hair. The moon was a cold coin in the chapel's skylight, and its light poured down in a deliberate stream, as if the world itself had poured a cup for the coming. Lucien knelt beside her like a man who had spent centuries learning how not to fall, and then discovered that falling was the only honest action left. He did not hold the ritual's tools. He held her hand and let his thumb draw the map of scars he had not known he would love. There was an intimacy in his touch that felt like confession. "You do not have to do this," he said, not as an order but as a plea that could not be accepted. "There are other ways. We will try them. We will find the balance." She opened her eyes and laughed then, softly enough that it could have been a mistake. "Other ways will cost others. I cannot let Mare be the ledger line anyone erases for the sake of an experiment. You taught me the difference between wanting and needing." Her voice dropped. "This is what I need to give." The healer prepared the instruments. A small athame etched with sigils that absorbed light, a cup made of a metal that seemed to remember rivers, and a chalice into which blood would fall and be offered to the architecture of stars above. Seraphine recited the lines she had learned, as if reading from an ancient, damaged page. The words were not all heard. Some were understood in the tightening of the throat. Eira's arm trembled as the surgeon priest, an old figure with hands like paper, raised the blade to the skin. The cut was shallow, ceremonial rather than murderous, but the blood that came was the color of old coins kissed by moonlight. It shimmered with that same silver thread that had marked her since childhood. The liquid fell to the chalice, and the sound of it was small and absolute. As the ritual progressed, memories flooded her mind with the insistence of drowners. She no longer felt alone in her body's supply of blood. Past lives, if they were hers or borrowed, overlapped and sang like layered instruments. She saw a woman in a grove making an oath to a creature with winter eyes. She saw a child by a bell tower. She saw a man, younger somehow and older in the way men grown by grief can be older than years, whose hands cupped the face of a woman and promised safety he could not keep. The visions came not as plot points but as weather, thick, inevitable, and dampening. Lucien began the incantation at Seraphine's lead, his voice a baritone that seemed to smooth the pages of the chapel's stone. The words wound around the blood, around the moonlight, around the breath of human observers who watched like mourners and prosecutors at once. Eira felt the chalice warm under her hand and then colder as the world listened. Then something else happened. The little child, the one who had first run into Eira's life from the bell-torn square, slipped into the chapel as if the fog had given her passage. She moved silently to the altar and stared with eyes that were old as sorrow. No one told her this was not permitted. She simply stood, and she was permitted by something older than law. Eira watched the child and felt the last of her hesitation peel away like dried skin. The child reached out and touched her fingers, a gesture that made the chapel feel like a room where forgiveness had been printed onto the air. The healer sang the last note of the incantation, and the chalice trembled. Light from the skylight narrowed into a laser of silver that struck the blood and made it sing. Eira's pulse beat like a drum. She thought of Mare's hands shaping dough, of the scent of yeast, of the small rituals of a poor life that became vast when measured against an immortal's ledger. Lucien's face was a study in concentrated grief as he watched. He had been the architect of many calculations. He had never been prepared to watch sacrifice make its own geometry. Tears slipped from his eyes, and he did not wipe them. They fell onto Eira's palm like small, startling jewels. In that act, he betrayed the cenotaph of his restraint. He had trained himself to withhold, and now he surrendered to the shape of a human sorrow that had no measure. "Not like this," he murmured, though the ritual left no space for other words. Eira moved and the air thickened, as if the world found its breath held in order, and then let it out. When the blood touched the moonlight, the chapel seemed to dissolve and reconceive itself using rules older and more patient than the courts. The light took the blood and made of it a thread. That thread reached outward like a root and then inhaled the curse like a lung taking a breath for the first time in winter. Pain arrived then, not a clean cut, but a rolling, pervasive thing. It filled Eira with its particular diplomacy. First it was a cold that traveled inward, then heat like the sun testing a chill, then a watery, expanding ache that made her see the castle and the town and the child, and mare as if they were one small body laid end to end. She felt the curse pulling at the thread of her being as if trying to rip what had been woven to fit itself. Lucien made a sound that was not a word. The sound bent the air into a raw pitch. He had always known his hunger had a price. He had not known that the price could be capital. Eira's breath drew thin, beautiful arcs. The healer chanted faster, the syllables dropping like stitches trying to hold a hemorrhage at bay. Outside, the battle noticed the change. Weapons fell silent for an instant as soldiers on both sides felt the world hinge on a note. The moonlight thickened over the chapel like a lid. For those breaths, the world held a tentative hope. Then the world cracked. The sound that erupted was not merely the shattering of a curse, but the unfixing of a long-held covenant. Sunlight, old, remembered, and long absent from the castle's interior, found a fissure and poured through like a river. It struck the vampires first like a verdict written in light. Some writhed as if the world had turned and found them in the wrong season. They burned with a transient, horrid beauty. Not sudden combustion, but a slow, graceful collapse, as if each centuries-old bone unstitched itself and unmade its vows. Others fell to their knees, not dead but changed. Eyes that had held skies now reddened and then cleared. Hunger that had been a law became an ache. Eira felt the ritual's cost in the marrow of herself. She had given something old and necessary, and the world remembered the sun in a way it had not for generations. The chalice cooled and the moonlight receded like a tide. The little child at the altar began to sing, a small sound like a bell taking first breath. Mare coughed and then inhaled with a breath that was real and not borrowed, and her eyes, once a film of fever, cleared like glass open to air. Eira's body, however, answered with a softness that frightened those who loved her. Her skin cooled, and her pulse slowed to the pace of a tide withdrawing. Lucien pressed a hand to her brow as if to keep heat from fleeing, and when he felt it leave, he made a sound like a man who had been promised a thing and then found it had been taken. "No," he said then, and the single syllable uprooted the composed facades of centuries. He wanted to bargain with fate itself, and for once bargaining did not suffice. Eira's eyes found his, and she smiled, not triumphant but serene, like someone who had finished a long, necessary task. "You taught me," she whispered, and the words were wet with the memory of every kindness he had offered by stealth. "You taught me that love is not what we take, it's what we give." He leaned forward, unable to stop himself. He kissed her hand with a reverence that belonged in churches. Around them, the chapel filled with the sounds of a world learning new grammar. Cries of pain, shouts of wonder, whispers of relief. Some vampires burned where they stood and were dust in a wind that moved like an answering hymn. Some staggered, then collapsed, paler and mortal, as if they had been reintroduced to a climate they had been sheltered from for too long. Eira's breath thinned further. Mare, now coughing and steadier, reached out and took her daughter's hand. The touch was small and ordinary and miraculous at the same time. "My brave girl," she breathed, and the words were both a benediction and a farewell. Lucien held Eira as the last of the ritual unwound its knots. The sun rose, a slow, reluctant sovereign, and its light found the castle's stones, making them glow lucent and new in a way that made people on both sides of the conflict weep, with the odd joy of seeing something formerly forbidden. When the sound diminished and the new sun's light flushed the chapel with an unfamiliar warmth, Eira's chest rose once more and then stilled. Her body was cold and beautiful beneath the linens. Her hand lay in Lucien's as if it had chosen its final place. He could not move for a long time. He had watched the machinery of fate tilt and had learned that even kings could be under the hand of what they had once called fate. Around him, the world reconfigured itself. Some vampires learning to speak with voices that now tasted like salt and breath. Humans unconscious of how close they had come to losing everything. The prophecy's phrasing, "The sun shall rise on one who is both," had been fulfilled in a way no one could have predicted. It rose because a child had given, and because an immortal had learned how to mourn the castle's ruin in the days after the ritual felt like an old theater after the play's curtain had been let down. Props scattered, lights still hot, actors gone. Those vampires who had survived the sunlight's judgment stood on balconies and in courtyards, stunned into a new mortality. Some fled into the world in panic, craving anonymity. Others knelt, as if remembering how to pray. The nobility's architecture of ambition had been smashed and remade into something rawer and simpler. People required food, shelter, work, not covenants. Marrowend's militia limped back across the moors, faces hollow with the truth they had learned. Monsters were neither gods nor demons. They had been, for many, the product of longing and law. Some of the townsfolk wept. Some clasped hands and swore to rebuild. Even the bell, mute for so long, seemed to vibrate in the town's bones as if it were trying to remember its function in a world that had been altered by light. Lucien carried Eira's body out of the chapel, as if it were the most precious thing he had ever been permitted to touch. He wrapped her in a cloak that had been his in another era, one embroidered with small stitches of gold and the symbols of a line that had lasted centuries. His steps were slow and sure, as if a man who had danced with death had finally learned the right cadence for grief. Mare walked beside him, steady now, the cough muted and her eyes clear. She reached for the hand that had been Eira's and held it a little while longer, unwilling to let go, but the world had already moved. She said little. Grief does not always need words to be sharp. At the castle gate they paused. The sun spilled over the moors in a sheet of light that made the dew on the grasses look like spilled silver. Lucien looked at the horizon as if committing its shape to memory. He laid Eira gently upon a litter, and then, with a tenderness that was almost an apology, he lifted her and carried her down toward the sea. There are some images that survive in a world's mythology because they are honest. A king who carries the body of the one he loved out into the dawn, not as a conqueror, but as a mourner. He walked along a path where the air smelled of salt, and the sky had the newness of a thing that had been given back a name. Waves broke against the shore like the applause of a universe that had not been certain it would ever see daylight. At the water's edge, Lucien set Eira's body down and knelt. He had no words for the altar he had been given, not prayer but a raw translation of longing into motion. He opened his cloak and wrapped Eira in it like a shroud, and then, with hands that trembled, he lifted her again and walked into the surf. The water closed over them, and the world became a different kind of silence, the sea holding secret and sorrow alike. What happened next some people swore they saw, and others reckoned as metaphor. Lucien walked into the sun with Eira in his arms like a man who had finally found the simplest truth. Love is not an armor to be worn, but a thing to be given up. The light swallowed them both in a slow, luminous hush. Those closest could not tell if he was gone into death or into a different life. They could only tell that the silhouette that had been a king left in the most human of departures. Mare stood at the shore and held a single red flower she had plucked from the garden that had bloomed where the castle's ashes lay. She laid it on the tide line where foam met sand and let it float. It drifted and then sank, a small sign that memory and loss are both soluble and that the sea remembers. In the days that followed, the town and the castle stitched themselves back into an uneasy, honest peace. Laws were re-examined. The nobility that remained found themselves accountable in strange, human ways. The bell began to toll again, a single note at first, and then more confident as if it too were relearning voice. Children played where soldiers had once marched. A market reassembled. The world did not return to what it had been, nor did it become something entirely new. It became an altered place, where grief and light shared territory. The last image anyone could agree upon was the one the little girl painted in the memory of the town. Lucien walking toward the sea with Eira in his arms until the sun took them both like a benediction. Some said he had gone to join whatever lay beyond mortality. Some said he had chosen exile and that the ocean was his judgment. But others, more fanciful, perhaps kinder, said that he had gone to keep her where the sun could touch her face every morning. Mare kept the garden near the ruins. Red flowers grew among stones and lichen. The petals shone like small, stubborn hearts. People would come and place tokens along the wall where the castle's shadow had been sharpest. They would tell the story of the blood heir, of a girl who made a choice that bent the world, and of a king who learned that power without tenderness is a language no one should speak. In the hush of twilight, when the bell tolls and the sea breathes, someone, sometimes a child, sometimes an old woman with eyes like maps, swears they have seen a figure on the horizon, a silhouette that stands against the sun like a promise. It is the rumor that keeps grief from settling into finality. It is the small salvation that stories offer. That love, once given, may be carried from the shore into whatever waits beyond, and that the sun, at last, remembered how to rise on both those who were human and those who had once been called monsters after the chiming silence broke, and the sun once more found its old roots. The world did what worlds always do when the worst of a storm has passed. It began to heal in noisy, awkward, human ways. The moors that had been trampled by marching feet and dragged by armored riders filled slowly with the small, stubborn work of repair. Men who had raised spears folded them into scythes and plowshares. Those who had sworn revenge learned how blunt a tool a hand can become when it is guided by mending rather than fury. The bell of Marrowend, long mute, and then a single reluctant voice, grew steadier as if it too were learning how to keep time in a changed sky. The castle that had once loomed like accusation above the valley was no longer an altar to a single, unanswerable hunger. For some of the old court, daylight arrived like a sentence. Those who had desired power above mercy dwindled into small, private exiles. Others who had been content with their appetites discovered a life of necessities they had not known how to tend. The nobles who remained bent their long wills to more earthly things. They learned the rules of feeding a town, not a court, of tending failing roofs and mending walls. For a generation, there were awkward meetings at the market, barter between former enemies, formal apologies offered in the hard, honest way that rebuilding requires. Vampires who had survived the first, burning daylight found mortality awkward and urgent. Some fled into the wide world and became anonymous laborers in places that did not remember the old hierarchies. Others stayed and learned to bargain for bread, apprenticed to craftsmen, found small and ridiculous pleasures like the sting of sun on newly human skin. There were funerals for those who had become ash. There were marriages, too, the kind that stitch small lives together when larger dramas have been exhausted. Life resumed its small economies of affection, and in those economies, the legacy of the sacrifice was paid forward in 100 small kindnesses. A roof mended, a child taught to read, a widow given a piece of bread before coin was counted. Marrowend itself became, slowly, what it had always tried to be, a place not merely of survival but of community. The market that had once sold fear as easily as flour sold laughter again. New houses rose where the militia had camped. The bell tower was rebuilt with hands that had once held weapons. Its new iron tongue was tempered with a smith's humility. People carved the names of those lost into stone and sang songs that made sorrow into a shared thing, less sharp for being communal. Children played where soldiers had marched, and the sound of their running was like a small, brave benediction. Among these returning rhythms, Mare was a quiet, bright thing. She had been pulled back from the brink by the ritual that cost her daughter everything beautiful and irreversible. She tended a garden in the hollow of the castle's remains, a deliberate, local miracle, red flowers that sprang stubborn and vibrant from ashes. She planted them as if burying sorrow could be a kind of cultivation. Morning after morning, she bent over soil that had been enriched by the ruins and coaxed out blooms that shone like small rubies against the gray. Where the castle's stones had been cold, the flower beds warmed. Where the laughter had been scarce, it returned like tide. People came to the garden not merely to look, but to learn how to care. They brought soil and seeds and tools with the awkward reverence of those who bring flowers to a grave. Mare taught children how to press petals between pages and how to braid small crowns of leaves for summer festivals. She kept a particular patch of earth near the chapel's ruins for a single red rose, and every morning she would check that the soil had not been disturbed, whispering names to it that seem ordinary until one remembers what names do. They remind the world that a life was lived and loved. In the evenings, she would sit on a stone and look out toward the sea as if trying to locate a shape she half expected to find there. She never spoke ill of Lucien. His name had become a complicated thing in the town's folk memory. A ruler and a mourner, a sovereign who had learned how to be small when needed, and who had paid a price no ledger could properly account for. People left wreaths made of red petals at the foot of the garden wall, and then left, carrying with them a feeling that the world, though altered, had not been emptied of its capacity to care. Stories do something that law cannot. They let ambiguity live and breathe in the mouths of people who will pass them on. After the sun reclaimed its rights, tales took root faster than statutes. In the market, around hearths, on the benches outside the rebuilt tavern where Eira had once worked, people told the story of the blood heir in many voices, some reverent, some bawdy, some cynical, some odd. But in the quiet places where children are instructed in manners and myth, an image persisted. Of a silver-haired woman at twilight by the sea, a figure both luminous and unsure, neither entirely a ghost nor wholly mortal. Rumor is not one thing but a weathered collection of smaller certainties, and the rumor of the silver-haired woman gathered like morning fog. Some said she was Eira returned, reborn in the liminal place between tide and sand, a soul given a second sitting in a life unsullied by prophecy. Others said she was a child of those who had been freed from hunger and turned a little part vigil into prayer at the shoreline every evening. There were even those who believed she was not a person at all, but a figure made by shared sorrow, a chorus of wishes that a mother's loss might be soothed. Lucien's voice became its own kind of legend, too, carried by those who had heard it in the hush of the chapel or in the murmured testimonies of those who had watched him walk into the sea. "The sun rises for her, and I walk its light," people quoted him saying, words that felt, depending on who spoke them, either confession or benediction. In any case, his line gave the town something to anchor their grief to, not a verdict, but a vow. It explained, for those who needed explanation, why a king would carry a child into dawn, and why oceans and shores and endings sometimes met in a single, strange silhouette. Mare tended the patch of roses as if she were tending the shape of a story. Each bloom was a line, each season a chapter. She would sometimes pick a single red rose, close her fingers around its stem, and walk to the shoreline where the tide made an honest, deliberate noise. There she would place the rose on the edge of surf and watch it drift for a little while before it sank. In the act, people found ritual that was simple enough to hold: loss, release, remembrance. Children listened. They learned that some acts of love required more than courage. They required a kind of arithmetic one could scarcely name, giving that which is most costly. Teachers used the story as a caution about power and a lesson about mercy. Priests of many persuasions found the tale useful as a meditation. Even kings are taught to grieve. Even monsters can be reformed by tender instruction and sacrifice. At the sea, the little girl who had first pleaded for a mother's life, the same one who had led Eira into the mist on that lightning-scarred night, grew into the town's living parable. She was often seen, years later in the twilight, a small figure with a basket of wildflowers who walked to the shore and placed a single red rose upon the water. Sometimes she sang a child's song. Sometimes she was silent. No one knew if she was Eira returned in child form, or some other spirit that had been granted the duty of marking the place where sacrifice met the surf. That uncertainty became a gift. It allowed each person to put the finishing line of their grief wherever they needed it. For those who had loved and lost, faith in meaning had to be constructed anew. In the market, Lucien's lost court did its best to be useful, founding schools and offering apprenticeships to those children whose fathers had fallen. They taught carpentry, not conquest. They taught the suturing of wounds, not the stitching of treaties that made bodies currency. The castle's libraries were open to any who could read. The court's hoarded stores of knowledge were traded for the town's livings. In time, the place that had once been a symbol of distance and dominion became a kind of shared resource, a sorely earned commons. Yet the narrative would not let itself become simple. Some nights by the sea, villagers swore they saw a shadow walking at the edge of waves, tall and narrow, hands wrapped about a small bundle. It was the sort of sighting that people either treated as evidence of miracles or the last surviving hallucination of a world exhausted by grief. Both responses were true to human need. Stories that refuse tidy endings survive because they allow each generation to make its own conclusion. Mare grew old with the garden and the sea in her bones. She taught the children how to press rose petals into books and how to fold small notepaper boats that could carry messages they dared not speak aloud. On cold mornings, she would tell them the plain facts, that love had costs, that bravery and sacrifice sometimes look like quiet work. When she spoke of Eira, her voice was even and small. There was no need for grand gestures. The red roses did the speaking that remained, bright and rooted in a place the town could visit. In the hush of late twilight, when the bell lifted itself and the sea sighed, some still argued about what Lucien had done, sinner, savior, both, or neither. Others did not argue. They went down to the shore, put a single red rose on the water, watched it go, and felt a weight ease from a ribcage that had been carrying too much for too long. That slow, deliberate act was perhaps the truest legacy. Not the absolution of history, but the daily practice of remembering that even when the sun had been stolen, it could be coaxed back by the costliest of gifts. And so the circle closed in the only way it could, not by proof but by habit. The little girl, who might have been Eira, who might have been a child given the duty of memory, who might simply have been a single human heart that kept its promise, placed her red rose on the shore. The sea took it without comment. The town watched. The sun dipped and rose the next morning as promised. Somewhere beyond sight, a voice murmured that the world was kept together by what people gave away rather than what they tried to hold. Whether Eira had been reborn into that child, or whether she lay wrapped in a king's cloak beneath the sea did not matter as much as the fact that names were being spoken again, and that when the sun remembered her name, the world remembered how to begin.